Opening scene: a quiet office in a bustling city. The camera zooms in on a middle-aged black man, James, tidying his desk. His kind smile fades as his boss, Mr. Stone, a stern-looking man in a tailored suit, strides in. James had been the heart of the company for nearly 30 years. He wasn't just an employee, he was a mentor, a friend, and a living archive of the company's history. Everyone admired him except, it seemed, his boss. Mr. Stone had taken over management a few years back, and ever since, there'd been tension in the air. Some called it a clash of styles. Others whispered it was something much darker. But today, something was off. James noticed the stiff way Mr. Stone carried himself as he approached, his usual condescending smirk replaced by a cold, calculated expression. James straightened up, feeling a knot form in his stomach. "James," Mr. Stone began, his voice low and clipped, "we need to talk." James nodded, his heart racing. "Of course, is something wrong?" Mr. Stone hesitated for a fraction of a second, but it was enough for James to sense the weight of what was coming. "Your time here is coming to an end." For a moment, James thought he'd misheard. I don't understand. I've got a few months left before retirement." Mr. Stone's lips curled into a thin line. "The company's moving in a different direction. Effective immediately, your services are no longer required." The words hit James like a freight train. His years of loyalty, his sacrifices, his dedication, it all seemed to vanish in an instant, dismissed as if they meant nothing. "But," James started, trying to make sense of it. "I don't have time for arguments," Mr. Stone snapped. "This decision is final." James stood frozen, his world crumbling around him. He could feel the stares of his colleagues from across the room, their faces etched with shock and disbelief. What Mr. Stone didn't know was that James had kept meticulous records over the years, files and emails that painted a very different picture of this so-called direction. James had always believed in fairness and accountability, and now it seemed he might need those principles more than ever. As James packed up his belongings, the once vibrant office felt cold and hollow. But beneath his heartbreak, a quiet resolve began to grow. He might be leaving the building, but his story wasn't over. Little did Mr. Stone know, the choices he made that day would come back to haunt him in ways he couldn't imagine. Because what happened next would shake the very foundations of the company and Mr. Stone's life. Stay tuned, because this isn't just a story about injustice. It's a story about resilience, redemption, and the undeniable truth that what goes around comes around. The screen fades to black with a faint echo of James's footsteps as he leaves the office, carrying not just his belongings, but the weight of a decades-long journey cut short. As James walked out of the office building for what felt like the last time, his thoughts raced. He looked at the box in his hands, filled with the remnants of nearly 3 decades of hard work, family photos, certificates, and small mementos from colleagues who had come and gone. Each item told a story, a reminder of the life he'd built within those walls. But now it was all gone. The sky was overcast, as if mirroring the heaviness in his heart. He found himself sitting on a nearby bench, staring blankly at the cityscape. People bustled around him, oblivious to the storm brewing in his mind. How could this happen? How could a man like Mr. Stone, someone who barely knew the value of hard work, strip him of everything he had worked so tirelessly to achieve? James replayed the moment in his head, trying to understand where things had gone wrong. He had always prided himself on his work ethic, his ability to lead by example, and his knack for diffusing office tensions. When Mr. Stone had taken over, James had hoped for a collaborative relationship. Instead, he had found himself increasingly sidelined, his ideas dismissed, and his experience undervalued. But it wasn't just professional differences. Over time, James had noticed a pattern, a certain tone in Mr. Stone's voice, a deliberate coldness in his demeanor that seemed reserved only for him. At first, James had brushed it off as paranoia, but the signs had become too clear to ignore. Mr. Stone's interactions with other employees were starkly different, even warm at times. James couldn't help but wonder if this went deeper than just personality clashes. Sitting on that bench, James pulled out his phone and scrolled through his contacts. His wife, Linda, had always been his rock. They had weathered every storm together, from financial struggles to raising 3 kids on a modest income. He hesitated for a moment before dialing her number. The night before the hearing, James sat at the dining table, the house silent except for the occasional creak of the floorboards. Linda joined him, placing a comforting hand on his shoulder. "Whatever happens tomorrow," she said softly, "I'm proud of you. You're standing up for what's right, not just for yourself, but for so many others. That takes real courage." James smiled at her, grateful for her unwavering support. "I just hope it's enough," he admitted. "It will be," Linda said, her voice steady, "because the truth always comes out." The morning of the hearing arrived, and James walked into the building with his head held high. The room was packed, the tension almost suffocating. Marcus sat beside him, a reassuring presence as they waited for the proceedings to begin. Across the room, Mr. Stone sat with his legal team, his expression unreadable, but his body language betraying a hint of unease. James couldn't help but notice the way Stone avoided looking directly at him, as if afraid of what he might see. As the hearing began, witness after witness came forward, sharing their experiences and painting a picture of a toxic workplace culture. Each testimony added another layer to the case, building momentum like a rising tide. But the turning point came when Marcus presented the documents, the emails, the internal memos, the correspondence with HR. The room fell silent as the evidence was laid bare, each piece more damning than the last. Mr. Stone's legal team scrambled to object, to dismiss the documents as taken out of context, but the weight of the evidence was undeniable. James felt a surge of hope as he watched the carefully constructed facade begin to crack. But he knew this wasn't the end. The battle was still raging, and the outcome was far from certain. The final moments of the hearing loomed, the air thick with anticipation. Everyone in the room could feel it. The truth was finally coming to light, and the stakes had never been higher. As the hearing paused for a midday break, James stepped outside, the cool breeze offering a brief reprieve from the intensity of the proceedings. He leaned against the railing, staring out at the city, trying to steady his thoughts. The weight of everything was pressing down on him, but there was also a flicker of hope. The evidence was damning, the witnesses compelling. For the first time in months, it felt like justice might actually be within reach. Then his phone buzzed. James glanced at the screen, surprised to see an unknown number. For a moment, he considered ignoring it, but something told him to answer. "Hello," he said cautiously. The voice on the other end was quiet, almost hesitant. "James, it's Daniel. I need to talk to you. It's urgent." James straightened, his heart pounding. "Daniel, what's going on?" I don't know if I'm doing the right thing," Daniel began, his voice trembling. "But there's something you need to see. I've been sitting on it, trying to figure out what to do, but I can't keep quiet anymore." "What is it?" James asked, his anxiety growing with every passing second. "It's a recording," Daniel said. "A conversation I overheard between Mr. Stone and some of the board members. They were talking about you, about how this whole thing isn't just about cutting costs or restructuring. James, they planned this from the beginning." James's breath caught in his throat. "You're sure about this?" "I have it all," Daniel said. "I recorded the meeting on my phone when I realized what they were saying. They talked about how they couldn't let someone like you be the face of the company as it moved into its next chapter. They used words like outdated image and not the right fit, but we both know what they meant." James clenched his jaw, his anger surging. It was worse than he had imagined. This wasn't just discrimination. It was a deliberate, calculated attack to erase him and everything he stood for. "Can you send it to me?" James asked, his voice steady despite the storm raging inside him. "I will," Daniel said. "But James, you need to be careful. If they find out I shared this, I could lose everything." "You've done the right thing," James assured him. And I promise I'll do everything I can to protect you." When the recording arrived, James listened to it in stunned silence. The voices were unmistakable. Mr. Stone and several board members, their words dripping with contempt and veiled malice. They spoke of James not as a valued employee, but as an obstacle, a relic of the past that needed to be removed to pave the way for their vision. Then, out of the blue, James received a phone call from Mr. Stone himself. The tone was surprisingly cordial, almost apologetic. "James," Mr. Stone began, "I think we had some misunderstandings. Why don't we meet and talk this through? I'd hate for things to get messy." James could feel the anger rising in his chest, but he kept his voice steady. "I'm not sure what there is to discuss, Mr. Stone. My lawyer will be in touch." The call ended with an awkward pause, and James knew he had struck a nerve. Mr. Stone wasn't just worried, he was desperate. As the investigation gained momentum, more former employees came forward, sharing stories that painted a damning picture of the company's culture under Mr. Stone's leadership. Patterns of discrimination, favoritism, and unethical practices began to emerge, creating a storm that couldn't be ignored. But even as the evidence mounted, James knew the battle was far from over. Mr. Stone and his allies were powerful, and they wouldn't go down without a fight. James could feel the weight of the journey ahead, but he also felt a growing sense of purpose. This wasn't just about seeking justice for himself. It was about creating a better future for everyone who had been overlooked, undervalued, or cast aside. The story was still unfolding, and the stakes were higher than ever. James knew one thing for certain: the truth had a way of coming to light, no matter how deeply it was buried. And when it did, the consequences would be life-changing for everyone involved. The days leading up to the hearing felt like walking a tightrope. Every moment was laced with anticipation. Every glance over James's shoulder was filled with suspicion. Linda had insisted he take extra precautions, double-checking locks on the doors and keeping a record of any strange occurrences. The late-night phone calls with no one on the other end, the unfamiliar cars idling near their home, all of it added to the tension. But James refused to back down. Meanwhile, Marcus had been working tirelessly, gathering witness statements and compiling evidence. His confidence reassured James, but there was still a nagging doubt in the back of his mind. What if it wasn't enough? What if Mr. Stone found a way to bury the truth? One evening, Marcus called with an update. "James, I need you to come by the office first thing tomorrow. Something big just came in, and we need to go over it together." James barely slept that night, his mind racing with possibilities. When he arrived at Marcus' office the next morning, the tension in the air was palpable. Marcus handed him a folder, his expression serious. "This," Marcus began, "is a goldmine. One of the current employees managed to retrieve emails and internal documents before they were destroyed. It's all here, James. Proof of targeted discrimination, directives from Stone himself, even correspondence with HR showing they knew what was happening and did nothing to stop it." James flipped through the papers, his heart pounding as he read the damning words. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about an entire system built on ignoring and exploiting people like him, people who had given their all only to be cast aside. "This changes everything," James said, his voice shaking with both anger and hope. "It does," Marcus agreed, "but it also means Stone and his team will fight even harder. They'll do whatever it takes to discredit you, to make you look like the problem." James nodded, his resolve hardening. Let them try. The truth is on our side. As the hearing date approached, the tension reached a boiling point. James' name was being whispered in the hallways of the company he had once called home. Current employees were divided. Some cheered him on from the shadows, while others avoided his calls, too afraid to be seen taking his side. Then, just days before the hearing, James received an unexpected visitor. Sarah showed up at his doorstep, her face pale but determined. She had been one of the few voices brave enough to speak out, but now she looked shaken. "James," she said, clutching a folder to her chest, "there's something you need to see." She handed him the folder, her hands trembling. Inside were copies of more emails and documents, but these weren't from the company. They were from an external PR firm, a crisis management team hired by Mr. Stone. The messages outlined a calculated plan to smear James' reputation, discredit the witnesses, and spin the narrative in Stone's favor. "They're going to use your past against you," Sarah said quietly. "Anything they can find, even if it's out of context. They want to paint you as bitter and difficult, someone who couldn't adapt to change." James clenched his fists, the weight of the betrayal sinking in. He had always prided himself on his integrity, on living a life he could be proud of. The thought of someone twisting his story for their gain made his. As the hearing resumed, James passed the recording to Marcus, who listened with an expression of growing disbelief. "This changes everything," Marcus said, his voice low. "We need to introduce this immediately." But just as Marcus prepared to present the recording, the room was interrupted by a commotion at the door. Everyone turned to see a tall man in a sharp suit stride in, flanked by two assistants carrying briefcases. It was the company's head of legal, a man known for his ruthless tactics and no-holds-barred approach. The tension in the room skyrocketed as the new arrival whispered something to Mr. Stone, who smirked before standing up. "Your Honor," Mr. Stone began, his voice oozing confidence, "before we proceed, we'd like to introduce new evidence that sheds light on Mr. Williams's professional conduct." James's stomach dropped. He exchanged a glance with Marcus, who looked equally concerned. Mr. Stone's team presented a series of emails, taken out of context, manipulated to paint James as difficult and resistant to change. They claimed he had sabotaged projects, undermined colleagues, and refused to adapt to the company's evolving needs. It was a masterstroke of deceit, designed to shift the narrative and cast doubt on James' character. As the judge reviewed the documents, Marcus leaned over to James. "This is their Hail Mary," he whispered. "They're throwing everything they have at you because they know they're losing." But it wasn't just about winning anymore. This was personal. James could feel it in the way Mr. Stone glared at him, the smugness radiating from his every move. It was a battle of wills, and neither man was backing down. When Marcus finally introduced the recording, the room fell into a stunned silence. The voices on the tape were clear and unmistakable, their words revealing a callous disregard for fairness and integrity. The expressions on the faces of the company's representatives shifted from confidence to panic, and even Mr. Stone's smug facade began to crack. But just when it seemed the tide was turning, Mr. Stone's lawyer stood and issued a bold challenge. "This recording is inadmissible," he argued. "It was obtained without the consent of all parties, violating both company policy and privacy laws." The judge looked conflicted, torn between the undeniable relevance of the recording and the legal complications surrounding its use. James felt his hope waver, the tension in the room almost unbearable. As the judge deliberated, James realized something. This wasn't just about evidence or legalities, it was about courage. The courage to stand up, to speak the truth, even when the odds were stacked against him. The stakes had never been higher, and the outcome remained uncertain. All James could do now was hold on to the belief that justice would prevail, no matter how fierce the opposition. The story was far from over, and the final act was about to begin. The room buzzed with tension as the judge prepared to deliver a decision on the recording. James sat motionless, his hands clasped tightly together, his breath shallow. Beside him, Marcus leaned forward, a look of quiet determination on his face. Across the room, Mr. Stone's smug expression had returned, his confidence bolstered by his lawyer's argument. After what felt like an eternity, the judge spoke. "While the manner in which this recording was obtained raises concerns, its relevance to the claims being made cannot be ignored. I will allow it to be presented, but the defense will have an opportunity to cross-examine its authenticity and context." A wave of relief washed over James. The truth, raw and undeniable, would finally be heard. Marcus wasted no time replaying the recording for the court. Every word echoed in the chamber, each phrase laced with the condescension and prejudice that had fueled Mr. Stone's actions. As the tape played, the color drained from Mr. Stone's face. The board members shifted uncomfortably in their seats, casting wary glances at one another. By the time the recording ended, the room was silent, the weight of the evidence hanging heavy in the air. The judge turned to Mr. Stone's lawyer, who rose to his feet, his face a mask of composure. "Your Honor," he began, "while this recording is troubling, it does not prove discrimination. My client's decisions were based on business needs, not personal biases." But the argument rang hollow, and everyone in the room knew it. The recording, combined with the testimony and documents, painted a damning picture that was impossible to ignore. As Marcus delivered his closing statement, he spoke directly to the heart of the matter. This case is not just about James Williams. It's about a culture that allowed bias to flourish, but valued convenience over integrity. Today, we have a chance to set a precedent, to show that no one is above accountability. James nodded, but his mind was still racing. The stakes were too high, the outcome too uncertain. He tried to prepare himself for every possibility, but deep down, he knew this fight was bigger than him. When the court reconvened, the judge's expression was unreadable. James held his breath as the judge began to speak, summarizing the evidence and the arguments presented. Then, at last, the verdict came. The court finds that Mr. Williams was wrongfully terminated on discriminatory grounds. Furthermore, the evidence suggests a systemic issue within the company's practices that warrants further investigation. The words hit James like a wave, a mix of relief and vindication washing over him. The courtroom erupted in murmurs, the tension finally breaking. But just as James allowed himself a moment of triumph, the unexpected twist came. One of the board members, a woman who had remained silent throughout the proceedings, stood and addressed the court. "Your Honor, I have something to add." All eyes turned to her as she stepped forward, her hands trembling. "I can't stay silent anymore," she said, her voice steady despite the emotion in her eyes. "I was part of the decision to terminate Mr. Williams, and while I didn't speak up then, I will now. The truth is, this wasn't just about James. Mr. Stone had a history of targeting employees who didn't fit his vision, who challenged his authority. I was complicit, and for that I am deeply sorry." Her confession sent shockwaves through the room, solidifying what James and Marcus had fought so hard to prove. Mr. Stone's carefully constructed facade crumbled in an instant, leaving him exposed and alone. Outside the courtroom, reporters swarmed, their cameras flashing as James emerged. But he didn't care about the attention. What mattered was the message that had been sent, that truth and justice could prevail, even against the odds. As James and Linda walked away hand in hand, he felt a sense of peace he hadn't known in months. The fight wasn't over. There were still changes to be made, systems to hold accountable. But for the first time, he believed in the possibility of a better future. And somewhere in the distance, Mr. Stone sat in his corner office, staring out at the city he had once controlled, realizing too late that his actions had consequences. The days following the hearing were a whirlwind for James. He found himself thrust into the spotlight, not as a victim, but as a symbol of resilience and justice. The media painted him as the man who stood up against injustice and won, but to James, the victory was bittersweet. For years, he had given everything to that company, believing in the work and the people. To see the extent of the betrayal was something he was still coming to terms with. Linda, ever his rock, made sure he stayed grounded. "Don't let the noise distract you," she said one evening as they sat together on the porch, the sun dipping low on the horizon. "What you've done is more than just win a case. You've opened a door for others to walk through." She was right. After the verdict, several employees, both past and present, came forward with their own stories of mistreatment and bias. James couldn't help but feel a pang of guilt for not recognizing the signs earlier, for not speaking out when he first suspected things were amiss. But Marcus reminded him that change often starts with one brave voice. "You've done more than most people would," Marcus said during one of their many calls. And because of you, there's a chance to change things for the better. The company, now under intense scrutiny, announced a sweeping review of its policies and practices. Mr. Stone was removed from his position by the board, a move that many saw as an attempt to save face. Reports surfaced of internal turmoil, with several executives resigning amidst allegations of complicity in fostering a toxic work environment. It was clear that the fallout would be long and far-reaching. But James wasn't focused on the company anymore. His sights were set on what came next. With Marcus's help, he started a foundation aimed at supporting workers who faced discrimination and wrongful termination. He wanted to provide the resources he wished he'd had when he first realized the battle he was up against. The foundation quickly gained traction, with donations pouring in from people inspired by his story. At home, life began to settle into a new rhythm. James spent more time with Linda, finally taking the long walks and quiet evenings they had often talked about, but never seemed to find the time for. He reconnected with old friends, many of whom reached out after hearing about the case. There was a sense of closure in those moments, a reminder of the community that had always been there for him, even when he felt most alone. One afternoon, as James was organizing paperwork for the foundation, he received an unexpected call. It was Daniel. "Hey, James," he said, his voice lighter than before. "I just wanted to say thank you. What you did gave me the courage to leave. I've started my own business, something I've always wanted to do, but never had the guts for. Seeing you fight back, it made me believe I could do it too." Hearing that warmed James's heart. For all the pain and struggle he had endured, knowing that his fight had inspired others made it feel worthwhile. He and Daniel talked for a while, exchanging stories and laughter, a stark contrast to the tension that had once defined their interactions. Meanwhile, Sarah, who had played such a crucial role in exposing the truth, found herself on a new path as well. She became an advocate for workplace reform, using her experiences to educate others about the importance of fairness and inclusion. She and James stayed in touch, their shared journey forging a bond that felt like family. One evening, as James and Linda sat by the fire, she asked, "Do you ever regret it? Taking them on, putting yourself through all of that?" James thought for a moment, the flickering flames reflecting in his eyes. "There were times when I doubted myself," he admitted, "times when I wondered if it was worth it. But now looking back, I know it was. Not just for me, but for everyone who felt silenced, overlooked, or discarded. If I could help even one person find their voice, then it was worth every sleepless night." Linda smiled, her hand resting on his. "You've done more than that. You've shown people what it means to stand tall, even when the world tries to knock you down." As the months turned into a year, life took on a peaceful rhythm. James still worked with the foundation, mentoring others and sharing his story at events. But he also made time for himself and Linda, savoring the simple joys they had once taken for granted. The echoes of the past didn't fade completely. There were still moments when James would think about the betrayal, the people who had turned their backs on him. But those moments were fleeting, overshadowed by the gratitude he felt for the life he had built and the impact he had made. One day, as he stood in the kitchen preparing dinner, his phone buzzed with a news alert. He glanced at the screen and saw an article about the company's continued struggles. Lawsuits, resignations, and plummeting morale had left it a shadow of its former self. For a brief moment, James felt a pang of sadness, not for Mr. Stone or the executives, but for the workers who were still trying to make a living in the aftermath of the chaos. Linda walked in, sensing his mood. "What's on your mind?" she asked gently. "Just thinking about how things could have been different," he said. "If only they had chosen integrity over greed." She placed a hand on his shoulder. "You can't change the past, James, but you've already changed the future for yourself and so many others. That's what matters." James nodded, her words sinking in. The past had shaped him, but it didn't define him. What defined him was the choice to fight, to stand up for what was right, even when it felt like the world was against him. As he and Linda sat down to eat, James felt a sense of contentment he hadn't known in a long time. The battle was over, but its lessons would stay with him forever. He had faced the storm and come out stronger, ready to embrace whatever came next with an open heart and an unshakable belief in the power of truth and justice.